Hi, I'm Camille.
And I'm Rachel, and this week on Food Science, we have part 2 of our 2 Christmas special episodes, and we'll be making our favorite holiday cookies.
So in this week's episode, we'll be making 3 different kinds of cookies. We're going to be making double chocolate peppermint cookies, which are a drop cookie. We're making gingerbread cookies, which are a cookie that you typically roll out. And then we are also making Russian tea cakes, which are a ball cookie that doesn't spread at all. And then we'll be talking a little bit about the different properties behind those cookies and kind of how they turn out differently and how those different components combine.
Exactly. So before we get going on making all of these exciting cookies, I'm going to talk to you a little bit just about the different components of cookies and why it is that they bake different ways. So there are 5 sort of main components to any cookie recipe, which are flour, sugar, fat, eggs, and a leavening agent. So each of these components affects it in a different way, and the most important thing about these components is their ratio to the other components in sort of the mix that you're making. So flour's effect on cookie dough is affecting its texture. So the higher amount of flour you have in the cookie in comparison to the other ingredients, the more crumbly of a cookie you have, or lower ratio of flour that you have results in a chewier or crispier cookie. This makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Flour is very powdery. The more of it you have, the more your cookie's going to crumble after you eat it. Sugar adds a browning or crispiness component to it. So granulated sugar caramelizes as it bakes, and also as it melts in the oven, it spreads out to create a sort of thinner and crispier cookie. So the more sugar you have, the more that this process is going to happen. Now with brown sugar, which has molasses in it, light brown sugar has 10% molasses and dark brown sugar is 30% molasses. Molasses actually is a slightly acidic component. So not only does brown sugar add moisture to your cookie, but molasses will also make your component slightly more acidic when it bakes, causing all of the other proteins in the cookie to clump together faster, and this makes a chewier cookie. Fat adds tenderness, so the more fat you have, the more the cookie's going to crumble apart. So butter has a very low melting point, which means that it spreads more in comparison to other fat components like shortening or oil. Eggs add structure. It is the protein component of the dish, so when I talked about proteins clumping together, that's where those proteins come from. And the last component is leavening agents. Now, leavening agents aren't in every cookie, actually, and they actually have a different role than they might have in other doughs, like biscuits or breads, where the primary source or purpose for leavening agents is to make the dough rise, spread better.
Yeah, quick plug for our biscuits episode, which was our first ever episode. You can watch that on our channel.
Some cookies do actually rise a little bit. So these are a little bit more cakey cookies, chocolate chip cookies. People like to have a little bit more of a rise in it. And when you want to do that, you add baking powder. Some cookie recipes have baking soda in it, and baking soda actually does not act as a leavening agent. Instead, it acts as a basic component to counteract all of the acidic components that are also existing in the dish. The addition of acidic components can sometimes inhibit browning, and so adding in the soda counteracts the acidic sort of components and makes it brown instead. Yeah. With all of that background information, we are now ready to make our cookies.
Okay, so we're going to get started with the Russian tea cakes, and then we will be moving on to more cookies. This episode, just as a note, we're going to kind of do it at a quicker pace, obviously, since we have, like, COOKIEPALOOZA going on here. But we will, as always, include the recipes down below if you guys do want to follow along. So we are going to be simultaneously doing the first 2 steps in the recipe, just to conserve on time in the first leg of our cookie marathon. So I am going to be creaming the 2 sticks of butter that are at room temperature in a medium mixing bowl. I'm using, once again, a hand mixer. Work with what you got. And Rachel will be sifting the flour and the salt into that bowl there, and then I'll kind of explain as we go along. So let's jump right in.
Add all this to the sifter. So the most notable thing about Russian tea cakes is the fact that they do not spread at all like normal cookies. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first is that there is no leavening agent whatsoever in Russian tea cakes. The second is that it uses confectioner sugar instead of regular granulated sugar. And as I mentioned before, granulated sugar melts and spreads, causes the cookies to spread. However, confectioner sugar, because it's so much finer, does not melt in the same way, so your cookies don't spread as a result.
Once your butter's been creamed, you're going to add your vanilla to the bowl. Lovely. And then combine that, and then you're going to be gradually adding in the confectioner's sugar so that you cream that together with the butter. And now that we have that creamed mixture, Rachel is going to, for the second time, sift the flour and the salt mixture, and she's going to be adding it gradually while I stir it in.
The other notable thing about Russian tea cakes is their super crumbly texture, and what contributes to that is the fact that it's basically a large amount of flour and butter, and that's it. And because those components are so high, it contributes to a nice crumbly cookie.
Once you've incorporated all the flour into your wet mixture, which we cheated a little bit and Rachel kneaded the dough with her hands.
Highly recommended for cookie doughs once they get thick.
Yep, you are going to incorporate the finely chopped pecans.
A cup, which is a lot of pecans.
It's a lot of pecans. I'm just gonna fold it over. So once again, in this next step of our process, Rachel will be doing one task while I do another to speed this all along. Rachel has taken the dough that we just completed and folded those pecans into and is rolling them into 1-inch balls, evenly spaced out on a cookie sheet, and the cookie sheet is ungreased. When she's done, it's going to go in the oven at 325? 325. But while she's doing that, I'm actually going to begin our gingerbread cookies. So this recipe begins by having the butter, and you're going to cream it together with the sugar and the orange zest. Now, as a quick note, the recipe does actually recommend that you use a stand mixer fixed with a paddle attachment. We don't have that, so we're gonna make do, and it might just take a little bit longer.
So there are a few different components of gingerbread cookies that make them unique to being gingerbread cookies. The first thing is the fact that it uses butter as its fat content, as I mentioned previously, butter has a low melting point, which means that it's going to spread out more as opposed to other fat components, and that will lead to those nice thin, crispy gingerbread cookies that you are accustomed to. The addition of the egg and the molasses affects the composition of the gingerbread cookies in two different ways. So the addition of the egg, as I mentioned earlier, the egg is the protein, and so that is what adds structure to the cookie. And since there is less egg in ratio to a lot of the other ingredients, there's less of these structures that will clump together, and so it's going to create a little bit of a thinner cookie. Additionally, the addition of the molasses, as I mentioned earlier, adds some moisture. It also adds a slightly acidic component, and that acidic component causes whatever protein that is in the mixture to clump together faster, and that will make it a crispier cookie as well.
Now that we have creamed together our orange zest, our butter, and our sugar, Rachel is once again going to be helping me to sift the flour and the dry ingredients into this mixture as I stir to combine.
Okay. And again, we're doing it a little bit at a time.
You don't want to overwhelm it because then it just gets really hard to mix really quickly.
As a note, so the recipe that we're using does actually use baking soda and baking powder. However, more traditional recipes typically don't use baking powder or baking soda in them because they don't want the cookies to rise at all. And that's why the most traditional gingerbread cookies we're familiar with are that flat, thin kind of cookie because there are no leavening agents in them. There are a lot of recipes that still will include the baking soda because, as I mentioned earlier, it helps it to brown better, but again, baking powder typically is not involved.
Once your dry ingredients have been combined and it kind of looks like a slightly damp sand, you're going to start folding in the wet ingredients that Rachel has so kindly mixed. As a side note, Rachel just checked on our Russian tea cakes in the oven, and they're coming along. We ended up with 2 pans of them, so if you do as well, if you do the full recipe and you don't have it, then just make sure that you're flipping those pans halfway through baking so that they all cook evenly. Go ahead. This one actually does need to chill for about half an hour, so I will pass it on over to Rachel to wrap up. And welcome to our final cookie for the episode. We did it! We made it! We are going to be doing probably the most straightforward cookie last, which is the double chocolate peppermint drop cookies. If you haven't noticed by now, there's a bit of a theme. I'm going to start by creaming together the butter and the sugar. While I'm doing that, Rachel is coating all of the Russian tea cakes, which just came out of the oven, in powdered sugar and placing them on a wire cooling rack. Before you serve these, you're also going to want to put even more sugar on your sugar.
Because if there's one thing cookies need, it's more sugar. Oh, and while Camille is working on this, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the very simple science behind drop cookies. The fat content, again, a higher fat content makes it a more crumblier, crispier cookie. And the addition of the granulated sugar, which is in a much higher ratio than our other previous recipes. As you know, drop cookies are put in as a ball and they spread while they bake. And the granulated sugar contributes to this since it melts, and as it melts, it spreads out in yolk.
After a few minutes of creaming your butter and sugar together, I'm going to add the egg, as well as the peppermint extract. Woo. I'm not going to add the shells. Nobody wants that in their cookies. Gross.
There's a much higher ratio of egg to rest of components in this recipe in comparison to our previous recipe of the gingerbread cookies. And what this does is it adds more protein to the cookie, which also adds a lot more structure to it, which means you get thicker cookies. And everybody knows that really good chocolate chip cookie is a little bit chewy, a little bit thick, a little bit of a undertaking, so this will help contribute to that.
Undertaking. What cookies are you eating that are man, I just need to set aside some time?
Thank you so much, guys, for joining us for our second Christmas special episode of Food Science.
If you enjoyed our episode, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to us on YouTube to keep up with all our videos.
Thanks so much, guys. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.